Mr. Chairman.
The chair will, the gentlelady will suspend. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 334, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mrs. Lowy of New York.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman. I thought he was going to go.
Mr. Speaker,
Does the gentleman from
we're prepared to accept the lady's amendment.
I thank the gentleman.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady.
Statement in the record.
Without objection. The question is on the gentlewoman from New York's amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I'm sorry. For what is the For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I offer amendment number 413, printed in the Congressional Record.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Oh my God, they haven't challenged it yet.
Amendment number 413, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Ms. Woolsey of California.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentlewoman's amendment.
The point of order is reserved. The gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Amendment 413 states that none of the funds made available by this Act may be used in Department of Defense overseas contingency operations budget for military operations in Afghanistan until the President seeks to negotiate and enter into a bilateral status of forces agreement with Afghanistan. Mr. Chairman, we've had troops deployed in Afghanistan for nearly a decade now, making this the longest war in our nation's history, costing more than $378 billion with no real end in sight. Close to 1,500 brave Americans have been killed, and they've been killed in the line of duty there. Roughly 10,000 have been wounded. And yet the United States does not have a status of forces agreement, or SOFA, with Afghanistan. The SOFA is a very basic tool that spells out the terms of U.S. military operations in a given country. The United States is party to more than 100 such agreements for engagements great and engagements small, including Mali, Montenegro, and Micronesia. We have a SOFA with Iraq, signed in the year 2008, which sets out a deadline for complete withdrawal of troops by the end of the year. SOFA agreements determine how the laws of the foreign jurisdiction should be applied to U.S. personnel while in that country. They lay the foundation in a number of areas, including economic, cultural, and law enforcement matters. So it's beyond irresponsible, Mr. Chairman, that in Afghanistan, the country where we are currently waging our longest and most expensive war, we have no such agreement. There is no formal structure to provide rules governing the presence of hundreds of thousands of Americans in that sovereign nation. This must end. It's both morally and fiscally irresponsible. And that's why I've submitted this amendment. It requires the President to negotiate and enter into a bilateral SOFA with the government of Afghanistan. A SOFA would establish that the temporary presence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan is at the request and invitation of the host government. It would prohibit permanent military bases in Afghanistan, and it would provide a date no later than 1 year after the signing of the agreement for complete, safe, and orderly redeployment. That includes armed forces, civilian DOD employees, and military contractors. Without a SOFA, Mr. Chairman, a SOFA with Afghanistan, our leaders can continue to extend our occupation indefinitely while the cost surges, our deficit rises, and our economy falters. That is poor military strategy and poor fiscal planning. A SOFA provides certainty and clarity about what we're doing in Afghanistan and how much longer we need to be there. It would provide the framework and momentum for redeployment consistent with the terms of the Iraq SOFA. My amendment would move us a critical step closer to an end to this disastrous war, the safe return of our troops back home, and taxpayers' dollars invested in domestic needs right here in the United States. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Mr. Chairman, I insist on my point of order, and I make a point of order against the amendment because it proposes to change existing law and constitutes legislations in an appropriations bill and therefore violates Clause 2 of Rule 21. The rule states in pertinent part, and I quote, "An amendment to a general appropriation bill shall not be in order if changing existing law." The amendment imposes additional duties. I ask for a ruling from the chair.
Does any member wish to be heard on the point of order? The chair will rule. The amendment contains a legislative condition on the availability of funds in the bill. As such, the amendment violates Clause 2 of Rule 21. The point of order is sustained. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. Amendment number 516 is printed in the congressional record. Today I offer an amendment that is long overdue. Last June, a live bighead Asian carp was discovered 6 miles from Lake Michigan, north of the locks and well past the electric barrier. This discovery... All right.
Does the gentleman wish to offer the amendment?
Yes.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 516, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Camp of Michigan.
The gentleman may proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, last June, a live bighead Asian carp was discovered 6 miles from Lake Michigan, north of the locks and well past the electric barrier. This discovery shows that Asian carp, one of the world's most rampant invasive species, are at the doorstep of the Great Lakes. Weighing up to 100 pounds, spanning over 6 feet, and eating half their body weight daily, Asian carp have the ability to decimate fish populations indigenous to the Great Lakes. These giant bottom feeders would destroy the region's $7.5 billion fishing industry, as well as the 800,000 jobs that are supported by it. To prevent this catastrophe, ecological experts have said that closing the locks that separate the Illinois River from Lake Michigan is the single most important step we can take to prevent these species from entering the Great Lakes. In 2009, the Michigan Attorney General filed a petition in federal court to direct the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to immediately close the locks. This petition was supported by Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, New York, and Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the court denied the petition. But after the court's decision, I introduced the CARP Act along with Senator Stabenow of Michigan that would immediately close the locks. And since then, despite the imminent threat of Asian carp, the administration has refused to close the locks, and all we have received is promises of studies that will take years to complete. You will surely hear arguments from those opposed to closing the locks that doing so will disrupt the movement of cargo and cause serious economic harm to the region. Economists who have examined those claims have found them to be grossly exaggerated. An economic study conducted in 2010, which I will insert in the record under general leave, found that if cargo passing through the locks had to be transported by land, it would increase truck traffic in the surrounding area by only 0.1%, or the equivalent of adding 2 additional freight trains to the over 500 leaving the region each day. Any supposed economic impact of closing the locks would pale in comparison to the multi-billion-dollar industries that would be wiped out by Asian carp. The state of Michigan's response to the administration's Asian carp framework pointed out, and I quote, "The framework statement that the Chicago lock is the nation's second busiest ignores the fact that in 2008, only 39 loaded barges carrying approximately 100,000 tons of cargo, mainly sand and gravel, moved through the lock. Moreover, according to the Corps' own data, the 2008 vessel traffic consisted of 34,000, not 50,000 vessels, mainly recreational watercraft. The canal is only 9 feet deep in some areas." You'll also hear critics claim that this amendment will tie the hands of the Corps in assisting flood emergencies. Again, those claims are not accurate. The Corps has sufficient authority to protect human life and property in the event of flooding and other disasters under the authority granted to it by the Flood Control and Coastal Emergencies Act and other Corps regulations. Those authorities allow district commanders to issue a declaration of emergency and use Corps resources to help state and local authorities respond. Opening the locks to deal with flooding is the exact type of scenario this authority is intended for. Mr. Chairman, every day of inaction puts the Great Lakes ecosystem, the largest body of fresh water in the world, and the 800,000 jobs sustained at risk. Inaction is unacceptable, and I urge all members to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Chairman, to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I appreciate the recognition and stand to oppose the gentleman's amendment. And first of all, also to make the observation representing the northwest corner of the state of Indiana that I believe the gentleman is mistaken in suggesting that the state of Indiana supports the closure of the locks. It is my understanding that the state of Indiana opposes the closing of the locks. I would agree with the gentleman's assertion that we face a very serious problem as far as the carp, and I and others have certainly joined in that concern. As a member of the Energy and Water Subcommittee for over a decade, we have been working assiduously on this particular problem, not only with the Army Corps of Engineers, but with an assortment of state and federal regulatory bodies, because no one wants carps in the Great Lakes. But I would emphasize to this body that it is a work in progress, and at this point, the closure of the locks is uncalled for. The second point, and the gentleman talks about the economy, there is an economic issue. Speaking for the state of Indiana, I would point out if those locks were closed, the impact as far as the loss to economic activity in the state of Indiana is $1.9 billion, and 17,655 jobs in Indiana would be affected. We're trying to create jobs in this economy, not strike them from beneath us. And finally, this issue is not without controversy. It has ended up in the courts. The gentleman's absolutely correct about that. Twice, the United States Supreme Court has rejected arguments by the Michigan Attorney General that closing the locks is eminently needed at this point in time. Last year, the state of Michigan brought the question of lock closure before the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. On December 2nd, Judge Robert Dow ruled against the state of Michigan on their request for a preliminary injunction, explaining that the lock closure could inflict certain harm on the economy and that the state of Michigan had failed to demonstrate that the Asian carp presented an ecological threat to the Great Lakes that was imminent. So again, I would urge all of my colleagues to oppose the gentleman's amendment, and I would yield back my time. I'd be happy to yield.
Gentleman's comments, and particularly at the opening of your remarks when you said your involvement in this issue for more than a decade, and the problem we have is we've run out of time. Really since 2009 when eDNA was found north of the locks, and now we found live Asian carp north of the locks.
And if I could recapture my time, I understand the finding of DNA, that is not carp. And again, everyone is working on keeping the carps out of the lake. The locks are not impermeable either. And we have court intervention and court rulings on this matter, and again, would ask my colleagues to oppose the gentleman's amendment and would again yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Strike the requisite number of words.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an issue that has grown and grown and grown. But let me say that I would agree with the gentleman from Michigan that we do not want the Asian carp to be able to get into the Great Lakes through and into Lake Michigan first. We have been working on this issue for 12 years. And it really what makes me upset to think that they seem to say, well, nothing has happened, and now it's an emergency that there is the Asian carp are going to get into Lake Michigan. Let me tell you that we have set up 2 electronic dispersal barriers that are in my district to stop the Asian carp from getting through. This is the only path from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and these 2 barriers are there. The Asian carp are 42 miles from the city of Chicago, and this is an emergency, and they have 42 miles to go. They have moved very slowly. Most of the population of the Asian carp are in the Illinois River around Shanahah, and right now the Shanahah, they have a contract with China to send the Asian carp over to be used as food in China. The Army Corps of Engineers has been doing everything, and this is for the last 12 years. And Congress has funded this to make sure that those Asian carp never reach the Great Lakes. And if they do, it would be devastating. So things that have happened are the 2 dispersal barriers, the bubble barriers, electrofishing, oxygenation, retinone used to kill the fish, the bypass screening barriers to combat the Asian carp. The problem is, and it's not just that the carp will get in there, and the gentleman from Michigan raised the question of whether that this is the only way that the Army Corps has said to stop the carp. It is not. And in fact, the Army Corps has said that even if the locks are closed, the Asian carp will be able to get through those locks. So this is not the answer. The answer is to find all of these ways to combat that. Invasive species are really hard to deal with, but I think what the Army Corps and all of the other agencies have been doing is something that we will be able to contain them, and eventually, I've been on fish kills before. There were 22,000 fish that were killed to make sure that these Asian carp had not gotten beyond the barriers. Not one of these fish was an Asian carp. Well, but the problems that we're really facing are economic, devastating to the state of Illinois, devastating to the states below Illinois down to the Gulf of Mexico, devastating to anyone that is using the locks to send goods back and forth. And in fact, we are facing 800,000 jobs lost with the barge traffic. People don't realize how much this is used because of the barge. You're not stopped by a barge for when the gates go down. You're not stopped having a barge on the streets. What has been determined that if we were to shut down the barge traffic, it would take, and it said, oh, well, we just put them on the rail, or we put them on trucks. If we were to put these on trucks, if you were to take and line up the trucks from the East Coast to the West Coast, line them all up across the country, and then put them all back, going back to the East Coast, that's how many trucks it would be to be able to move the asphalt, the salt, the coal, all of these big items that are used and used in the economic thing of things, as well as the food and everything else that goes up and down. So I think that the Corp has testified that all of things are working. There is another study out that is going to be finished by 2015. We have got to get this right, and they've worked. But But having worked for 12 years on this, it really upsets me when the gentleman states a study from the Wayne State saying it will only cost $4.5 million in damages for economic. Oh no, the barge people, all of the people estimate it's at least $29 billion. This bill was to make sure that we can get the economy back going, that we can create the jobs. This will destroy jobs. And I'm also talking about flooding. It will flood the city of Chicago, and it will flood 124 suburbs. I urge a negative vote on this.
Time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Another amendment is currently pending. For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my friend from Michigan. I appreciate his interest in this issue. I have to strongly stand up and oppose it, though. The 11th in Illinois, which is my district, is very, very focused and very reliant upon the ability to move commerce, the ability to have transportation, the ability for free flow of goods back and forth. That's a major, major industry in my district. A lot of jobs rely on it. One of the great assets we have is the ability to float goods. That's a great thing. The fact of the matter is, when we talk about closing the locks and dams, we talk about the entire Chicago's region's water and sewer infrastructure system is built on the idea that water flows out of Lake Michigan via the lock system, and cutting those off would completely devastate the area. Possibly closing the locks permanently is totally not a solution to the problem. As most people have seen, the locks themselves are not even completely sealed. Even when closed for allowing for some leak, it still allows for some leakage. At a time when we're addressing a continuing resolution, we should give the Army Corps of Engineers time to finish their study. Let's continue to be cautious. We're talking about $30 billion in commerce that's going to be affected in my area because we want to quickly make a judgment on this. I understand the passion, I understand the concern, but let's be very cautious. At a time when the Chicago area, when my district has an economic downturn and people are waking up every day wondering if they're going to be able to feed their family or if they're going to have a job the next day, or people are driving on the interstates wondering if they can even get to work on time because there's already enough trucks. And now we want to add more and more trucks if we close these. That is the absolute wrong answer to this. And so I'm asking for, let's defeat this in this continuing resolution. Let's give the Army Corps of Engineers time they need. I ask my fellow colleagues to stand up and oppose this. It's too quick. The time is we have to be cautious. We have to wait. We have to see. When we took the majority, one of the things we talked about is being cautious when we get involved in free market and commerce. And we've talked about that caution and what we want to do to create jobs and what we want to do to allow people to get back to work and to solve this deficit not just by cutting spending, but by cutting the unemployment rate. Well, I'm telling you, this would be terribly devastating for the people in Illinois, for the people in the 11th District, and frankly for folks in the region.
I very yielding, and I just want to comment, the gentlewoman from Illinois mentioned about her 12-year involvement in this issue. In fact, she and I worked very hard in 2006 to get the first funding for the electronic barrier. But that was 5 years ago. To wait for this study that I hear my colleagues call for is another 5 years. How much time is it going to take before we eliminate the threat to the entire Great Lakes ecosystem?
Reclaiming my...
And so with that, I would yield back and just appreciate the gentleman yielding.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I understand. This takes time. When we talk about affecting $30 billion in economic commerce, I would expect that to take some time. Now, again, I appreciate the concern. I appreciate everything we're dealing with. This is a very serious issue. But my goodness, the people in my district are already waking up, wondering if they're going to have a job tomorrow, begging the free market to work. And that's all we're asking. Look, if we want to take this up at a later time, fine. But is it really appropriate when we're debating hundreds of amendments to a continuing resolution for this to be the area where we do something that's frankly been working or has been in study for 5 years and has a lot more to go? So with that, I yield back and thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, for what purpose are you seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in opposition to this amendment. As a resident of the Chicagoland area and a lifelong resident of the state of Illinois, this amendment would have devastating implications to the economy. Right now, we need jobs. Everybody on both sides of the aisle has been talking about how we need to jumpstart the economy and put people back to work. This is an amendment, and I have a great amount of respect for the chairman and him and his work, but I think this is an amendment that is going to have devastating implications to people all across that region. It's going to look to cost about approximately $29 billion. When we look at the amount of commerce that's going to be coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, through the Mississippi River, into the Chicagoland area, and yes, through the Great Lakes and back and forth, this is something that we must, at this point in time, not rush to judgment. I recognize that we have been studying this problem for a period of time. I recognize that there's actually even interim studies. In fact, there's an interim study that's even out. The interim study number 3 has been actually out, allowing us to move forward and to try to address some of the problem. I would ask my colleagues that we do not rush to judgment. This is a decision that will have an enormous effect on thousands of jobs and on commerce across the Great Lakes, going actually down to the Mississippi River and into the Gulf. Today, when we're talking about jobs in the economy, we have to look at how many things that we can promote. I've spent time in actually the locks. I've gone through the locks several times. I use them not only for recreational use, but I also seen the barges come through. This is a very active lock, and it's one that we need to make sure is alive and well. I do want to recognize that we have a problem with Asian carp. It's not one that we want to ignore, and certainly please hear that I am not saying that we should ignore it. I think that we need to continue the studies. We need to be looking at alternative ways to try to prevent it from invading the Great Lakes. No one is going to be a greater proponent of the Great Lakes than I am. But this is an amendment that I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to rise up and stand against. And I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I simply rise to concur with the last group of speakers who have indicated that they were in opposition to this amendment. I have worked with individuals in the state of Illinois for the last several years. My congressional district runs right along Lake Michigan, and we've had a tremendous amount of effort to try and resolve this problem. It has not been resolved, and I would plead for more time, more study, more opportunity to come up with a resolution that works for all of the Great Lakes area, not just for some to the detriment of others. I strongly oppose this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
I rise to strike the requisite number of fish.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing that moment of levity. I do rise today in opposition to the amendment offered by my friend and colleague, Mr. Camp from Michigan. And let me say, I think I take a second chair to no one in my respect for the gentleman from Michigan. I respect his passion, his leadership, the Ways and Means Committee, and his passion for the ecosystem known as the Great Lakes. I know is sincere, and it's real, and this problem is real. Anyone who's taken more than a passing glance at the issue of Asian carp recognizes that this is a serious but manageable threat to the Great Lakes region. It is one that deserves the continued attention of this Congress and this administration and the states within the Great Lakes region. But that being said, I rise in opposition to the Camp amendment for the following reasons. Principally because I believe that this amendment would have a devastating effect on Hoosier jobs and the ports of Indiana. The Kemp Amendment would prohibit the Army Corps of Engineers from operating the navigation locks located in the city of Chicago. It's the only waterway in the Great Lakes system with access to the Mississippi River Basin. The separation of the Great Lakes from the Mississippi River will cost thousands of jobs, will cause great harm to many Hoosiers who manufacture and grow our products. According to a study by the ports of Indiana, commerce through the Chicago locks is responsible for $1.9 billion in economic activity and nearly 18,000 jobs in my home state. In addition to the economic damage this action will inflict, I would submit respectfully that there is no evidence that actually closing the locks will definitely keep the Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife found a year ago that there is no, quote, combination of lock operation scenarios that experts believe would lower the risk of Asian carps establishing self-sustaining populations in Lake Michigan, close quote. In fact, the Asian Carp Working Group, according to those, there are dozens of alternative methods fully to be explored, and Indiana is fully participating in the federal government-led effort to stop the Asian carp migration. Electronic barriers have shown promise. We need to continue energetically to work in that area. The gentlelady from Illinois also outlined different areas. Let me say, while I urge my colleagues to oppose the Kemp Amendment, allow me to use this moment to say that we will continue to lock arms with the gentleman from Michigan, with our neighbors in Michigan, our neighbors in Illinois, to deal with what is a very, very real threat to the ecosystem, to commerce in the area, to the enjoyment of the waterways in the area, and with that, I'd be happy to yield.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's words and also his commitment to try to work together to resolve this issue, and I appreciate the arguments he's making. But the concern is on the economic argument is that the damage to the Great Lakes, if this problem is not addressed, is irreversible and cannot be calculated. I can cite the statistics on the jobs and economic impact, but the ecosystem, the damage to that cannot be remedied. And the concern I have is this has really been a problem since 2006 when we worked to get the electronic barrier in, which has not worked. And here now we are in 2011 saying, let's wait another 5 years for the Army Corps to complete their study. And the problem is more imminent than that, and I cannot seem to get the administration to move on the immediacy of the threat to the system. So I will yield back, and I just want to thank the gentleman for the time.
Well, I was pleased to yield to the gentleman, and let me just say that the demonstration projects of the electronic fence began slightly before 2006. The fence and the studies are ongoing. Let me say, on behalf of other Hoosiers in the delegation, we're not patient to wait 5 years for action. We will continue to work with the gentleman from Michigan to work, Mr. Chairman, on behalf of immediate action, continue to call on this administration. The economic impacts are devastating. The impact on the ecosystem broadly would be equally devastating. And so we join the gentleman from Michigan in calling for urgent action by this Congress and this administration. I just respectfully offer that both with regard to its economic impact and with regard to its questionable effectiveness, that dealing with this from the standpoint of the locks and this continuing resolution is not the best approach. So with that, let me yield back the balance of my time and urge my colleagues to oppose the Kemp Amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 576, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Ms. Eshoo of California.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentlewoman's amendment.
The point of order is reserved. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I admire the most about our country is our commitment and our love for democracy. We were founded on the ideal that it is the people who choose their government. We believe in the principle of one person, one vote, not $10,000 or $100,000 a vote. We believe in the free exchange of ideas to be able to decide which candidates deserve our votes. But money, and lots of money, heaps of money, from undisclosed sources are having a corrosive influence on our political campaigns. Money distorts the voice of a particular point of view, making that voice seem louder, making it seem more influential, or making it seem more persuasive than it actually is. We don't know who is saying what to whom. Is it big oil? Is it polluters? Is it the insurance industry? Is it the tobacco industry? All too often, these distorted views come from corporate interests, and they try to undermine the public interest through campaign expenditures. These corporate interests, Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Members, please take their conversations off the floor. Gentlelady may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All too often, these distorted views come from corporate interests that try to undermine the public interest through campaign expenditures. These corporate interests can buy elections by throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars into a race for a particular candidate with attack ads against another. Last year, sadly, the Supreme Court overturned a landmark law and other centuries-old precedents aimed at limiting the influence of corporations in our elections. Now, today, we have stealth organizations formed for the sole purpose of running attack ads, and the American people don't have a clue who's footing the bills. The American people have a right to know who's trying to influence them. And if corporations want to try to persuade voters about their point of view, then they should stand behind their words. Let voters judge the facts for themselves. Voters are smart. Let them make up their own minds on Election Day, as long as they have full and accurate information about the interests that are at stake. So my amendment is a common-sense solution to a difficult political problem. It requires that any company that does business with the federal government disclose their political contributions, period. It's simple, it's clear, it's fair, and it's called disclosure. This amendment says if you're a federal vendor receiving taxpayer dollars, you're required to disclose how much you spend to influence the political system. Why? Because with public funds come public responsibilities. My amendment honors the First Amendment, and it places no limitation on political speech. It simply requires transparency.
Mr. Speaker?
The gentlelady's time is
Mr.
expired.
Speaker?
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to ask to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to support the amendment presented by Congresswoman Eshoo on behalf of the public interest, the people's interest, free elections and a healthy, transparent, and open public discourse. More than 1 year ago, the Supreme Court opened the floodgates to unlimited corporate spending, secret, unlimited corporate spending, and influence over our campaigns and our public policy debates. In doing so, and the Citizens United decision dealt a harsh blow to a fundamental principle of our democracy, that voters determine the outcome of elections, not moneyed special interest. In response, with bipartisan support in this House of Representatives, the House passed the Disclose Act to require corporations to stand by their ads the same way candidates do, and to keep foreign-owned entities from playing any role in our elections. The measure included a provision to keep government contractors and TARP recipients beneficiaries of taxpayer support out of our elections, preventing them from using taxpayer dollars for their own agendas. Senate Republicans, in the Senate, the Republicans blocked the Disclose Act, yet the value it represented, that sunlight is the best disinfectant, must remain a call to action for both parties in both houses. Many of the new members who are here campaigned on the principle that special interests play too big a role in our democracy. Many of them.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Members, please take their conversations from the floor.
The American people have constantly called upon Congress to act in the people's interest, not the special interest. Today, we have another opportunity, thanks to Congresswoman Eshoo, to answer the public's call to action for transparency, for openness, for true democratic elections. Thanks to Congresswoman Eshoo, we are highlighting this critical challenge to our democracy through an amendment to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not directed to federal contractors who refuse to disclose their political expenditures. No dollars in this act can be used to engage in enter into a contract with any corporation or company which refuses to disclose its political expenditures. They could be using taxpayer dollars to weigh in a secret, unlimited way in campaigns.
Mr.
With
Speaker,
the
House is still not in order. Our former Speaker is speaking from the well and deserves
It's not a message that some of our members want to hear.
Would the gentlelady
because it
suspend, please? The committee will be in order. Members, please take your conversations off the floor.
I know that this is a message that some of you...
The gentlelady may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that some of you may not want to receive this message, but it is a message that the American people have delivered to us over and over again, that they do not want special interests with their secret, unlimited expenditures dominating our elections and therefore dominating public policy in this Congress. So I'm grateful to Congresswoman Eshoo for highlighting this critical challenge to our democracy, again through an amendment to ensure that taxpayers' dollars are not directed to federal contractors who refuse to disclose their political expenditures. With this measure, we could take one step forward in the fight to restore fairness to our political process and preserve the integrity of our elections by disclosing the unlimited, secret, endless flow of corporate dollars into campaigns. This Republican majority, many of you voted for the Disclose Act as presented by Mr. Van Hollen in the last session. I hope that you will choose again between putting the corporate interest or choosing the public interest. It should not be a hard choice, but we will find out soon enough where you stand. I urge all of my colleagues to join Congresswoman Eshoo in continuing a fight for meaningful reform and to advance the cause of accountability in our campaigns. We owe it to the American people. We owe it to our founders who invested so heavily in this democracy. And we owe it to the future. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
Strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the California. You know, this isn't that complicated. It all gets down to the lesson that we all learned in grammar school. Honesty is the best policy. Not more complicated or not more complex than that. Honesty is the best policy. There is not a member of this chamber, Mr. Chairman, who doesn't believe in the First Amendment. I believe in the First Amendment. I believe that in a democracy you can say almost anything you want about almost anybody. You have the right to say what you want, but people have the right to know who is funding your message. When people turn, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, the House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct.
When people...
The gentleman's correct. The gentleman will suspend. The committee, please come to order. Members, please take your conversations off the floor. The gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When people turn on their television sets and they see a political commercial making outlandish claims, they deserve to know whether that commercial is being funded by a foreign-owned corporation. They deserve to know whether that commercial is being supported by a special interest group. They deserve to know when they're watching a commercial about how evil a candidate is, whether it is being funded by a special interest that is trying to defeat that particular candidate because that particular candidate supports the Environmental Protection Agency, supports clean air, supports clean water, and whether a special interest is trying to defeat that candidate because they want to dismantle the EPA. They have the right to know whether when one of those commercials permeate our airwaves, whether those commercials are being funded by a special interest, for example, that wants to dismantle federal inspections of meat, because those federal meat inspections are impinging on the bottom line of that particular special interest. And so this is simply about the right to know. This is simply about upholding our right to say what we want, when we want, about who we want, but making sure that the American people, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, understand who is behind that message. This says that the American people and the American taxpayer shouldn't be unwittingly subsidizing dirty campaigns and secret donations. And that is why this amendment is so important, because the American people and taxpayers have the right to know, and because honesty is the best policy. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Then time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman
Mr.
from New
Chairman,
Jersey
I continue to reserve my point of order.
The point of order is reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, the issue raised by this amendment is to whom does this Congress belong? In whose interests are the members of Congress working? Now, Mr. Chairman, every one of our constituents will draw a conclusion about that question based upon how we vote, what we do, and what we say. And every one of us will face the consequences of that conclusion in the next election. One of the facts that I think every voter has a right to know is who is funding and supporting the campaigns of any one of us who seeks the honor of serving here. Whether you belong to the most progressive group on the Democratic side, the most libertarian group on the conservative side, whether you're a member of the Tea Party, whether you're a member of a union or the Chamber of Commerce, I think every voter deserves and believes that they deserve the right to know who is funding the campaigns that bring people here. This is a basic matter of transparency and full disclosure. Frankly, Mr. Chairman, I think if we're honest among ourselves, we know how much the American people despise the political ads that vandalize their television screens every fall. A lot of people I know turn the television off or turn the sound down because they're so exhausted of hearing ridiculous, personal, dirty attacks by one side against the other. I would hope that someday the level of civility could rise where we all stop that. But I think until we get to that day, people at the very least have the right to know who is paying for it. From where is this money coming? Ms. Eshu's amendment is very simple, very plain, and should be supported by people of all ideological stripes. It says the public has a right to know where the money is coming from. And if you think a special interest group that promotes traditional energy supplies, oil and gas, is a good thing, then you'll be happy that they're paying for commercials. And if you think that someone who's running on a platform promoting the woman's right to choose, then you'll be happy knowing that some of their money may have come from people who sympathize with that point of view. So irrespective of where you come out on substance, shouldn't we all come out to a place that says the public has the right to know who's funding these campaigns? So to whom does this Congress belong? Well, if we look at the legislation before us today, it certainly looks like it doesn't belong to oncological nurses. because money for cancer research is being cut in this bill. It certainly doesn't look like it belongs to police officers walking the beats of America's towns, because upwards of 15,000 police officers will be laid off as a result of this bill. Certainly doesn't belong to America's school teachers and guidance counselors, because under this bill upwards of 10,000 reading tutors and math coaches will lose their job under this bill. 7,000 special education teachers under one version of this bill would lose their jobs. So if this Congress doesn't belong to nurses, police officers, teachers, to whom does it belong? One of the answers to that question would certainly come from answering the question, who paid the bills to get the members here? Who wrote the checks and who made the contributions? I hope that our friends would join us in supporting this amendment. I think it's clear and simple. But if they don't, maybe one of the reasons they don't want to join us in supporting this amendment or even hearing this amendment is they don't want the public to know who wrote the checks, who paid the bills, and who paid the freight. Everyone should have the right to know who funded the campaigns that brought people here. It's as simple as full disclosure. It makes great sense, and I urge a yes vote on Ms. Eshu's amendment. Yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Strike with requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this amendment. This is a continuation of the effort by the other side to undo the even-handed approach that was utilized by the U.S. Supreme Court in their decision of Citizens United. In that case, the Supreme Court decided that the Fifth Amendment protections that you have for free speech are not in any way diminished by virtue of the fact that you say it not with a single voice, but you join with others. And every response to it that we've heard from the other side has said, well, we don't like what the court did, so what we're going to do is put certain requirements on those who are corporations, but not the same requirements on those who are unions, representing those who are employees of the federal government. And there, of course, is as much a conflict of interest in that regard as there is on those corporations that have contracts with the federal government. So once again, they're trying to talk about how this action by the Supreme Court was unfair. It somehow requires that there is an unfairness involved, that our elections were taken over by corporations. Every study has shown that there were far more expressions of political thought in paid advertising by those on the left than those on the right in the last election. But we don't hear about that. And so if they would bring forward something that would have equal treatment, maybe then we could take a look at it. But the fact of the matter is we have seen effort after effort after effort. We can recall last year when they brought it to the floor, one of the things they wanted to do was not only have uneven treatment with respect to corporations and unions, but they were engaged in an auctioning off of First Amendment rights according to whether you were a favored or disfavored group. We saw organizations that were given specific exemptions. Oh, National Rifle Association was one of them, and there were those on the left. And if you had enough political sway, you got exempted from the disclosure requirements. And that really is the definition of capital cronyism, where the government decides who is favored and who is disfavored. And that the essence of the decision by the Supreme Court was the acknowledgement that the First Amendment has its most essential protection in speech, which is political speech. And if that be the case, we should tread very lightly where we require disparate treatment between different groups, those favored and those which are disfavored. If there's one thing the First Amendment stands for, it is that we treat everybody the same. And this, again, is in keeping with what we saw last year. Some people are more favored than the others. And when you're talking about First Amendment rights and expressions of political thought, we should be very wary of it. And by the way, nothing with the Supreme Court decision changed the prohibition against direct contributions to campaigns by corporations. that has been, that continues to be, and will be a felony. And if people on the other side have evidence of that happening, they ought to give that information to the Justice Department and have people prosecuted. So let's at least talk about what the facts are, and let's remember the history of this effort on the other side of the aisle. Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot about the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, and we may agree with that decision or disagree with that decision, but the fact of the matter is that's the law of the land. This amendment does not try to overturn that decision. This amendment is perfectly consistent with that decision. It simply says that when you are spending the money, expending the money, you have to disclose to voters that you're trying to influence their vote. It's the right to know. Now, because we are dealing with an appropriations bill, a government spending bill, we can't address all of the entities out there in the country that may be trying to spend money to influence elections. But what we can do, not at this moment. I got my 5 minutes, and I'm going to use them, but I thank you. What we're saying in this bill is that if we're really trying to save the taxpayer some money, which we should all be trying to do, we should try to curb the influence of the special interests who spend a lot of money hiring lobbyists to influence us and spend money in campaigns trying to influence the outcome of elections. Now, just in the last couple days, we've had a lot of votes on some issues that could affect federal government contractors in a very big way. Just yesterday, we had a vote on something dealing with a big military contract. So here's my question. That contractor that got taxpayer money or the one that didn't, could say, look, I want to reward the folks that supported me. I'm going to run a bunch of TV ads in their campaign supporting them. Say thank you. I want to get you reelected. Or they may say to the folks who voted against that federal government contract, hey, I want to make sure that person doesn't come back here because they may vote against my contract again. They may want to save the taxpayer some money, but we're going to spend some of our money, federal contractor getting taxpayer dollars, we're going to spend some of our money to try and unelect that person who voted against our contract. This amendment is really simple, and it would have a direct impact on all the conversations we're having. If you're a federal government contractor, if you're getting taxpayer money and you decide to run political advertisement in people's campaign to try and reward those who supported you or punish those that didn't, you at least have to disclose that information to the voters. You at least have to say who you are and how much you're going to be spending. And it seems to me, if we're genuinely interested in saving taxpayers' dollars, which we all should be, we should give the taxpayer whose dollars are going to those contractors the right to know whether those contractors are turning around and spending money in these elections. So if we're ever going to really work to try and curb those interests, those special interests that work so hard to try and get special benefits out of the federal government, we should at the very least say, come clean with the taxpayers, simply disclose. This is not an infringement in any way on free speech. They can still run an ad in anyone's district, and they can say whatever they want to the voters. No restrictions whatsoever. All we're saying is when you do that, let the taxpayers know. After all, the taxpayers have helped provide the funds for your contract. At the very least, you should tell the taxpayer, the voter, who you are that's spending money to try and influence the outcome of an election. And it seems to me that's the very least we can do to try and provide more accountability, more transparency. We keep hearing from everybody, that's what we want, more transparency. Okay? Let's let the voters know. Why wouldn't you want to let the voters know? So, Mr. Speaker, let me just conclude by saying this is a very simple amendment. If you're a federal government contractor, you're getting taxpayer dollars, you decide to get engaged in the political process, as is your right, and after the the Citizens United, you can get directly involved expending money in those campaigns. You can do that. You can say what you want. Just tell the taxpayer who you are, what you're spending to try and influence their vote. And I hope that we will adopt this amendment. I thank the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for offering.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word and yield my time to the gentleman from California.